Picture this. It's mid-morning, somewhere in ancient Central Asia, around 40,000 years ago, and a woman is picking her way carefully across a field of sharp volcanic rock that's been sitting in the sun long enough to be genuinely unpleasant to touch with bare skin. She's moving steadily, not scrambling, not wincing with every step, covering ground with the kind of confident, unhurried pace that only makes sense if what's between her feet and that volcanic rock is doing a meaningful job of protection. Wrapped around each foot, secured with strips of sinew, is something that looks crude by any modern standard. A piece of thick, dried animal hide, roughly shaped to the foot's outline, with a slightly thicker pad under the heel and ball of the foot where the impact is heaviest. Nobody told her to make these. There's no cobbler down the road, no shoe store, no internet tutorial explaining optimal sole thickness for volcanic terrain navigation. She figured out some version of this herself, or learned it from someone who did, because the alternative, crossing this particular stretch of ground barefoot at the pace her daily life required, was simply not a viable long-term option for someone whose feet needed to stay functional and undamaged across decades of hard use in genuinely unforgiving terrain. So here's the question. This entire video exists to dig into because it's surprisingly complicated for something that sounds so simple. When did ancient humans first stop walking barefoot? When did foot covering go from zero to something, and what does the evidence actually tell us about exactly how, why, and in what order this transformation happened across different ancient populations facing different terrain and climate challenges? Stick around because the answer involves some genuinely clever archaeological detective work, a surprising amount of biological evidence written directly into ancient human foot bones, and a few twists that reframe what we think we know about ancient life in genuinely interesting ways. Let's start with the foundational reality that determines everything else about this question. Ancient humans were walking constantly enormous distances across genuinely varied and often hostile terrain in a world with zero modern footwear and zero modern trail maintenance. We've discussed throughout this series how physically demanding ancient daily life actually was. The constant movement, the carrying, the foraging across large territories, the regular migration into new areas. All of that activity lands directly on the feet, repeatedly, across an entire lifetime, on surfaces ranging from soft riverside mud to sharp volcanic rock to frozen ground hard enough to cause serious injury without adequate protection. The question isn't really whether ancient humans needed foot protection at some point. The question is when and how they developed it. The frustrating, genuinely challenging part of answering this question archaeologically is that shoes, being made from organic materials, leather, plant fiber, sinew, bark, decompose remarkably quickly under most preservation conditions, leaving essentially no direct evidence behind. We have genuinely ancient pottery because pottery is ceramic and survives. We have stone tools because stone survives. We have bone needles and decorative beads because bone and shell survive. We have almost nothing in the way of direct footwear evidence from the deepest ancient periods because the materials ancient footwear was almost certainly made from tend to disappear completely within a few hundred years under normal soil conditions, let alone tens of thousands of years. This means archaeologists studying ancient footwear history have had to get genuinely creative about finding indirect evidence, and the methods they've developed are, once you understand them, genuinely impressive. The most compelling indirect evidence comes from somewhere nobody initially expected to find it, inside the foot bones themselves. Researchers studying skeletal remains from ancient populations have found a striking, consistent pattern in the specific development of bones in the smaller toes, the pinky toe specifically, and the adjacent toes, that appears to correlate directly with whether or not a population regularly wore foot coverings. In populations that habitually went completely barefoot across most of their daily activity, the bones of all 5 toes show robust, well-developed stress markers, consistent with all 5 toes being regularly used for grip, balance, and propulsion during walking and running. In populations that regularly wore some form of foot covering, even relatively simple ones, the smaller toes show measurably reduced development, apparently because even basic foot covering removes enough ground sensation and grip demand from the smaller toes that they stop being worked as actively during walking, and their bones reflect that reduced demand over a lifetime of use. This finding, published by researchers at Washington University and subsequently followed up by other research teams, provides genuinely remarkable indirect evidence for when footwear use began in different ancient human populations, specifically by looking at when this pattern of reduced smaller toe bone development starts showing up in the skeletal record. And the answer they found was genuinely surprising in its specificity and its timeline. The transition appears to show up in the skeletal record at around 40,000 to 26,000 years years ago for certain populations, suggesting that some form of foot covering, even if simple and crude by any later standard, was already being used regularly enough to produce measurable changes in toe bone development by this period. That's a genuinely ancient origin for an invention that most people, if they thought about it at all, would have assumed appeared considerably later in human history. But 40,000 years is the skeletal evidence, and the actual origin of foot covering almost certainly predates even that, possibly considerably, because it would have taken many generations of consistent footwear use to produce the kind of measurable skeletal adaptation the researchers were detecting. Something that produces a measurable skeletal signature across a population almost certainly reflects a behavior that had already been established long enough to become genuinely routine, meaning the first crude foot coverings were almost certainly appearing considerably earlier than the first skeletal evidence of their regular use can directly confirm. Let's talk about geography and climate here, because the answer to when did ancient humans first stop walking barefoot almost certainly wasn't a single, universal event that happened at one moment across the entire ancient human world simultaneously. Different ancient human populations living in radically different environments and facing radically different terrain and climate challenges almost certainly developed foot covering independently at different times in response to the specific demands of their specific local environment. An ancient human living in warm, tropical East Africa with consistent access to relatively soft terrain covered in grass, soil, and riverside vegetation would have had considerably less urgent motivation to develop foot covering than an ancient human living in subarctic terrain navigating sharp frozen ground, or an ancient human regularly crossing volcanic rock fields in Central Asia, or an ancient human moving across sharp desert gravel in environments where foot injuries from the terrain itself represented a genuine, ongoing practical problem. This means the history of ancient footwear isn't one single story but multiple parallel stories, with different ancient populations independently arriving at similar solutions to the same basic problem through their own specific experiences with specific terrain challenges in their specific environments. It's the same pattern we've documented throughout this series regarding other ancient technologies, fire use developing in multiple places independently, food preparation techniques emerging in parallel across separate populations. Because the underlying problem, how do you protect your feet from terrain that damages them, was universal. While the specific solutions and the specific timing of their development varied considerably depending on local circumstances and available materials. Let's talk about what the earliest foot coverings almost certainly looked like, because this connects directly to the broader story of ancient material use we've covered extensively in this series, particularly in our video about how animals kept ancient humans alive. The most immediately available, most practical material for primitive foot covering was almost certainly animal hide, specifically the thick, tough hide from larger animals that provided genuine protective value against sharp surfaces and cold ground. Raw, untreated hide stiffens and becomes brittle as it dries, which is actually a significant limitation for something that needs to flex with the foot during walking. But hide that's been worked, compressed, and possibly treated with fat or brain matter through techniques we discussed in our animals video stays considerably more flexible and functional as a protective covering. The most primitive functional foot covering is essentially just a piece of hide, roughly shaped to the foot's outline, tied onto the foot with some form of cordage. This sounds almost embarrassingly simple, and it is, but it's genuinely effective at the primary job of preventing sharp objects, cold surfaces, and hot terrain from directly contacting the vulnerable skin of the sole. It requires no complex manufacturing process, no specialized tools, and no materials beyond what any ancient human group that had recently processed an animal would have readily available in the form of leftover hide pieces that might otherwise be discarded. This accessibility is genuinely important for understanding the timeline question we started with, because it means the invention of basic foot covering didn't require any capability. Ancient humans didn't already possess from the very earliest periods of their use of animal materials for clothing. Let's address something genuinely fascinating here regarding barefoot walking and running specifically, because there's a substantial body of modern biomechanics research that has direct implications for how ancient humans experienced walking and running before any foot covering at all. Research studying barefoot walking and running biomechanics has found that human feet, when walking or running completely barefoot on natural surfaces, naturally employ a forefoot or midfoot strike pattern, landing on the ball of the foot or middle of the foot rather than the heel first, which significantly reduces impact shock compared to the heel strike pattern that modern padded shoes with raised heels actually encourage. This means ancient humans walking barefoot across most terrain were likely doing so with a gait pattern meaningfully different from what most modern humans humans in cushioned shoes use, with the foot and lower leg absorbing impact more actively through muscular engagement rather than relying on artificial cushioning to manage it passively. This has a direct implication for what ancient foot covering needed to actually do versus what modern footwear does. Modern shoes, with their thick, cushioned soles and raised heels, actually enable a heel strike gait that would be painful and damaging barefoot on hard surfaces, but would be equally painful and damaging in thin-soled ancient footwear. Ancient foot covering, designed to be worn by people whose feet were already conditioned to a natural foot strike gait pattern through lifetimes of primarily barefoot movement, didn't need to provide the kind of cushioning and heel elevation that modern shoes provide. It primarily needed to provide protection against sharp objects, thermal extremes, and abrasive surfaces, while remaining thin and flexible enough not to disrupt the natural foot mechanics that barefoot conditioned ancient feet were using. This means ancient footwear development proceeded along a completely different design trajectory than modern shoe development, optimizing for surface protection and thermal management rather than for impact cushioning, producing something that would look extraordinarily minimal by modern standards but was genuinely well suited to the specific biomechanical reality of feet that had spent most of their lifetime developing through barefoot movement. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now let's talk about climate specifically, because cold weather represents a genuinely different, considerably more urgent motivation for foot covering than simple terrain protection, and it almost certainly drove independent footwear development in cold climate ancient populations regardless of what was happening in warmer regions at the same time. We've discussed throughout this series how dramatically ancient humans expanded into cold environments, with Ice Age conditions covering enormous stretches of territory that ancient humans successfully inhabited, clothing technology being absolutely crucial to this expansion in ways we covered extensively in our survival methods and fire videos. Foot protection in genuinely cold conditions isn't a comfort consideration, it's a survival necessity. Frostbite in an ancient environment with zero medical intervention can progress from initial numbness to tissue death and infection with devastating speed, and the feet, being the most consistently exposed and most difficult to keep warm through body heat alone during active movement, would have been among the first and most vulnerable body parts for cold climate ancient humans without adequate protection. This means ancient human populations expanding into genuinely cold territories almost certainly developed some form of foot covering very quickly, out of pure survival necessity, regardless of whether they had access to particularly sophisticated manufacturing techniques. Even the crudest, most primitive hide wrapping secured with sinew would have provided genuine, meaningful thermal protection compared to none at all, potentially making the difference between functional feet and progressively debilitating cold injury over the course of a single harsh winter. The survival urgency of foot protection in cold climates almost certainly produced footwear development faster and possibly earlier in cold climate populations than in warmer populations where foot protection was a practical convenience rather than an immediate survival necessity. Let's bring in something genuinely interesting here regarding the oldest actual direct footwear evidence that has survived, because while the deep ancient era leaves us primarily with skeletal indirect evidence, somewhat more recent periods do occasionally provide direct physical evidence of ancient footwear that gives us a clearer picture of what these objects actually looked like and how they were made. The oldest known directly preserved footwear discovered so far includes sandal-like objects found in various archaeological contexts dating back several thousand years, constructed from plant fiber, bark, and various other available materials depending on the specific environmental context. These objects, while considerably more recent than the skeletal evidence suggesting footwear used tens of thousands of years ago, give us genuine insight into the manufacturing approach and design solutions that ancient footwear makers arrived at, most showing straightforward, functional designs that prioritize sole protection and secure attachment to the foot over any decorative or status signaling considerations. The famous Ötzi the Iceman, discovered in the Alps and dating back around 5,000 years, was found with remarkably well-preserved footwear that has been extensively studied by researchers interested in ancient shoe construction construction. His shoes showed a genuinely sophisticated construction involving multiple layers of different materials, a bear hide sole for durability and traction, deer hide uppers for flexibility, and a mesh of tree bark for structure, all assembled together in a way that researchers studying the design have noted is functionally impressive for cold mountain terrain navigation. Ötzi's footwear, while considerably more recent than the deep ancient era we focus on in this channel, represents the kind of accumulated, refined construction knowledge that clearly didn't appear fully formed overnight but developed across many generations of accumulated material knowledge and practical refinement, exactly the pattern we've documented throughout this series for every other ancient technological development. Let's address something worth being genuinely direct about here, which connects to the skeletal evidence story we told earlier and adds an important layer of complexity. The transition from barefoot to regularly shod wasn't necessarily a simple, irreversible uniform shift across an entire population at once. It was almost certainly a gradual, variable process in which some individuals wore foot covering more consistently than others, some terrains demanded it more urgently than others, and some seasons made it necessary while others allowed comfortable barefoot activity. This means the skeletal evidence of reduced smaller toe development doesn't indicate a population that switched suddenly and completely to constant footwear use. It indicates a population that was using foot covering frequently enough to measurably reduce the habitual loading of the smaller toes over a lifetime, while still probably going barefoot in many specific contexts, particularly on softer, safer terrain where foot covering's benefits didn't outweigh the reduced sensory feedback it imposed. This variable use pattern makes complete practical sense when you think about it from the perspective of someone whose feet are genuinely their primary transportation technology. Going barefoot provides dramatically superior ground feel and sensory feedback compared to any foot covering, particularly for navigating varied, complex terrain where sensing ground surface texture and stability through the foot is genuinely useful. A skilled ancient forager would almost certainly have gone barefoot when the terrain and temperature allowed it, not from some aesthetic preference for minimalism, but because the additional information their bare feet provided about the ground beneath them was genuinely practically useful for safe, efficient movement. Foot covering would have been adopted when and where the terrain made the trade-off worthwhile, sharp or extreme surfaces where protection clearly outweighed sensory access, while barefoot movement would have continued in contexts where sensory feedback was more valuable than surface protection. Let's talk about something genuinely fascinating here regarding the modern barefoot running movement and what it might tell us about the ancient human foot experience, because this connects the deep ancient story to a contemporary conversation in an interesting way. The past couple of decades have seen serious scientific and popular discussion about the potential benefits of barefoot movement for foot health and injury prevention, driven substantially by research and writing that argued modern cushioned shoes may actually contribute to certain injury patterns by allowing gait mechanics that natural foot conditioning and barefoot experience would prevent. Whatever the current scientific consensus on the specific claims made in this conversation, the underlying point that ancient human feet were shaped by millions of years of entirely barefoot development, and that modern shoe design may in some respects conflict with that ancient conditioning, is genuinely worth taking seriously as a framing for understanding the ancient footwear story. Ancient human feet, by the time the first crude foot coverings appeared, had been shaped by millions of years of consistently barefoot evolution, developing specific structural features, arch geometry, toe configuration, the specific distribution of callus and toughened skin across the sole that were optimized for barefoot movement rather than for movement in any kind of artificial foot covering. The earliest foot coverings weren't working with some blank slate foot that could be redesigned around any support structure. They were working with a foot that already had its own deeply evolved functional design, and they needed to work within that design rather than overriding it if they were going to actually improve on the barefoot experience rather than simply replacing one set of problems with a different set. Let's circle back to our opening scenario one final time. That woman navigating volcanic rock with her crude hide foot coverings secured with sinew, covering ground with the confident, unhurried pace her protection allowed. Based on everything we've actually covered here, she was living somewhere in the middle of a transition that had been underway for potentially tens of thousands of years already and would continue developing for tens of thousands more. She wasn't inventing footwear. She wasn't even necessarily using the specific design she was wearing for the first time herself. She was using a practical solution that had accumulated and refined across many generations of people who'd faced similar terrain challenges in similar environments. Each generation contributing small refinements, better hide selection, more effective securing methods, slightly improved sole thickness to a basic design framework that previous generations had already established as genuinely worth the manufacturing investment. So when did ancient humans first stop walking barefoot? Based on the skeletal evidence showing measurable toe bone development changes appearing between 40,000 and 26,000 years ago in certain populations, the reasonable inference that the actual behavior predates its skeletal signature by many generations, the multiple independent development pathways almost certainly driven by different terrain and climate pressures in different geographic regions, and the broader pattern throughout this entire series of ancient human material innovation being driven by genuine practical necessity and developed through multi-generational accumulation rather than single-moment invention. The honest answer is that some ancient humans were probably wearing some form of crude foot covering considerably earlier than 40,000 years ago, with the specific timing varying enormously by population and environment, and the transition from never to sometimes in specific conditions to regularly in most conditions being gradual, variable, and driven by exactly the same combination of practical necessity and accumulated material knowledge that drove every other ancient technological development we've covered throughout this entire series. The human foot, shaped by millions of years of barefoot evolution, eventually met terrain, climate, and survival demands demanding enough that covering it became genuinely worthwhile. Ancient hands, equipped with the dexterity and material knowledge we've documented throughout this series, provided exactly the capability needed to do something about that. The result was, by any modern aesthetic standard, extraordinarily crude. By the standard of what actually matters in any given survival situation, whether it works for the immediate practical problem it's designed to address, it was exactly sufficient. And exactly sufficient, ancient human history demonstrates again and again, is frequently all that's actually needed.